like a political earthquake. In the days that followed, careers unraveled, secrets exploded into the open, and the balance of power in Washington shifted. What exactly did Jasmine do that brought the nation's most untouchable institutions to their knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air outside the Alexandria Federal Courthouse sliced through coats and collars like broken glass. Washington hadn't seen a freeze this sharp in years, but what waited inside was colder still. At exactly 8:03 a.m., a convoy of black Suburbans rolled up to the granite steps like a funeral procession. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the second vehicle, not in handcuffs, not under arrest, but summoned less than 24 hours earlier on a sealed emergency motion accusing her of donor fraud related to the federal Hope Forward initiative. No prior notice, no chance to prepare. The allegation came without specifics, but with consequences written in fire. Her breath curled into the air, fogging the lens of a reporter's camera before vanishing like smoke. Inside, the press gallery had reached critical mass, shoulders packed tight, microphones blooming from clenched fists like weapons. Everyone knew something was off. This wasn't a criminal trial, yet the atmosphere buzzed like a death sentence had already been passed. And then the bombshell detonated. Presiding over today's civil hearing, by personal and unexplained request, was none other than Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Civil suits didn't fall under his authority. So why was he here? What was so urgent, so politically radioactive, that a sitting justice had descended from Olympus to wield the gavel himself? Jasmine sat silently at the defense table, her back straight, her expression unreadable, but her presence unmistakable. She wasn't there to fold. She was there to fight, even if the rules had already been burned before her arrival. Across the aisle loomed Malcolm Reed, the federal prosecutor with a taste for blood and a camera-ready smirk. A man more familiar with Sunday talk shows than the courtroom protocol. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked through her, the way a hunter eyes a mount he's already decided will hang above his fireplace. The courtroom's paneled walls seemed to close in, every knot in the wood whispering betrayal, every flickering light casting judgment. Cameras rolled, live streams exploded. Across the country, millions tuned in. This wasn't jurisprudence, it was performance. And Jasmine Crockett, young, black, unbending, was painted not as the accused, but the already condemned. There had been no discovery phase, no jury, no hearing of the facts, just an allegation, a target, and a trap. This court hadn't gathered for justice. It had gathered to crush a voice that had risen too high. But before anyone could process the surreal gravity of the moment, before her team could even object, Justice Clarence Thomas raised the gavel and brought it down with a thundering finality that didn't echo law, but execution. The courtroom froze mid-breath. Without deliberation, without a single word from the defense, Thomas delivered the blow like a man dropping a guillotine. This court finds Representative Jasmine Crockett liable under civil fraud statutes, damages assessed at $500 million, he intoned, his voice as cold and mechanical as a stamp in a slaughterhouse. The words struck the air like a car crash. Reporters gasped. The court stenographer blinked, uncertain if she'd heard it right. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not because the number didn't stagger, it did, but because the sheer absurdity of the moment numbed everything else. $500 million. More than most cities could dream of budgeting. And not one document had been reviewed. Not one witness heard. Not one shred of context considered. In a country that claimed liberty and justice for all, Jasmine Crockett had just been publicly executed, without a trial, without a chance, and without mercy. Within minutes, the headlines ignited like a coordinated airstrike. Breaking, Congresswoman hit with $500 million fine in surprise civil ruling. Justice or political ambush? Thomas lowers the hammer. News anchors scramble to interpret it, some with trembling disbelief, others with gleeful nods. Radio hosts turned Jasmine into a punchline. Online, the hashtags became tribal war banners. Crockett crushed versus Justice hijacked. Political analysts shouted over each other on live TV. But to millions watching, it wasn't law they saw. It was punishment wrapped in procedure. A warning dressed as verdict. A black congresswoman had been silenced not by impeachment, not by scandal, but by the unchecked power of a courtroom willing to burn the Constitution just to bury her name. And the message couldn't have been clearer. Rise too far, speak too boldly, and they will not debate you. They will destroy you, not with bullets, but with gavels. But before the courtroom turned her into a symbol, before the cameras, the hashtags, the war over her name, there was a woman with no security detail, no title, and no gas in her tank, racing against a system that was never built to let her win. It was 6 years before her congressional badge. The summer heat in Dallas was merciless, shimmering off the asphalt as Jasmine Crockett slammed her car door and stared at the empty gas gauge blinking like a countdown. She was supposed to be in court in 12 minutes, representing a black grandmother facing eviction from a building owned by a state senator's cousin. No taxis, no ride shares, no backup. She kicked off her heels and ran. 2 blocks, in a pencil skirt, past honking horns and catcalls. Sweat poured down her spine, but her eyes never left the courthouse entrance, like it was the last open door to justice. She arrived with 30 seconds to spare, barefoot, flushed, and cross-examined the plaintiff's lawyer so cleanly that even the judge asked for her closing argument twice. She won that case, not because she was polished, but because she was dangerous with the truth. Jasmine didn't grow up with generational wealth or prep school connections. She came from neighborhoods where the streetlights didn't always work, where grocery stores locked the formula behind glass, and where the only time you saw a lawyer was after something had gone wrong. She watched her mother cry over late bills and eviction notices, each one a warning shot from a system designed to squeeze the poor and excuse the powerful. She kept her first paycheck framed, $234, for defending a wrongfully accused teenager who hadn't spoken a word in court because no one had ever asked him anything that wasn't a threat. While others climbed through networking events and campaign galas, Jasmine fought her way up through protests, shelters, union meetings. Her name didn't rise on cocktail napkins. It was spray painted on cardboard signs at rallies. She didn't run for office because someone told her to. She ran because no one else would. There were no billionaires bankrolling her message, no TV spots dripping with endorsements, just folding chairs in church basements, microphones that crackled when she spoke, and a fire that couldn't be staged. The people who backed her had never voted before, but they came out for her. The women who cleaned the Capitol floors, the men who lost their pensions in rigged deals, the kids whose schools hadn't had working AC in 5 years. And when she won, by 612 votes, it wasn't called an upset. It was called a warning. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask permission to speak. She kicked the door open and told the truth so loud it echoed into the rotunda. And now the same system that ignored her rise was scrambling to engineer her fall. But while Jasmine's rise had been built in the open, fueled by people and purpose, her fall was being engineered behind closed doors, calculated, deliberate, and executed with surgical precision by men who feared what she represented. In a soundproof conference room 4 blocks from the Capitol, 3 men in tailored suits stared at a dossier stamped confidential. Malcolm Reed, the prosecutor who craved headlines like oxygen, leaned over the table, tapping a pen against the edge of Jasmine Crockett's photo. "She's too clean," he muttered, "but no one stays clean under pressure." Across from him sat 2 senior DOJ advisors, one of whom had direct ties to corporate PACs Jasmine had recently exposed on the House floor. They weren't afraid of her personality. They were afraid of her momentum. Focus groups showed she was making inroads with independents, even conservative veterans. Her speeches weren't viral fluff. They were fire alarms. The plan was ruthless but simple. Open a civil fraud investigation under vague donor mismanagement claims tied to the Hope Forward program, a policy Jasmine had championed. Skip the indictment, skip the jury. Hit her with a fine so massive it would turn her into political roadkill before midterms. But for that to stick, they needed legitimacy. They needed a name that would make even the critics pause. That's when Clarence Thomas's name was floated, a symbol of conservative endurance, untouchable in robes and impossible to challenge without setting fire to the entire judiciary. On paper, it made no sense. a sitting Supreme Court justice presiding over a civil matter? But behind the scenes, it was genius. He wouldn't be the prosecutor. He wouldn't author the charges. He would simply be the face of the ruling, the hammer, not the hand. Reed made the call. One conversation, one private dinner, one promise that restoring trust in institutions required one highly visible verdict. Thomas didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His invitation arrived on thick stationery, handwritten, unsigned. And 3 days later, without explanation, the highest court's shadow reached into a courtroom it didn't belong and wrapped itself around Jasmine Crockett's throat. The gavel had fallen, the cameras had caught it, and the vultures were already circling. But beneath the weight of injustice, Jasmine Crockett didn't crumble. She calculated. The courtroom was still vibrating with shock when Jasmine slowly turned her head, just slightly, toward her lead counsel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fumble for words. With the calm precision of someone who had seen this ambush coming from a mile away, she whispered, "It's time to flip the cards." 9 words. Quiet enough to be missed by most. But to her attorney, Illa Hartman, they were thunder. No outrage, no panic. Just the cool detonation of a woman who had waited patiently for the system to overplay its hand. Her eyes never left the bench. Her posture remained unshaken. But the temperature in the room shifted. What they had mistaken for surrender was strategy, and they had just stepped into her trap. Illa Hartman rose slowly, like a storm cloud forming on the edge of a still sky. A former federal investigator turned civil rights litigator, Illa was known in legal circles not for flash, but for precision, the kind of lawyer who never spoke unless the words could cut through steel. Every movement was intentional. No drama, no wasted motion. From beneath the defense table, she lifted a large, weathered golden envelope, thick with the weight of withheld truth. Its seal was unbroken, but the energy it carried was explosive. It came from deep inside the Department of Justice, smuggled out by a whistleblower who risked their career to expose a lie that had metastasized at the highest levels. Illa didn't speak as she approached the bench. Her heels struck the marble floor like a countdown. Reed sat motionless, knuckles white around his pen. Justice Thomas leaned forward, slightly, hesitantly, as if he sensed what was coming wasn't just evidence, but reckoning. The envelope was placed gently on the judge's desk, but it might as well have been a ticking bomb. For a moment, no one breathed. No cameras clicked. The room froze, because everyone in that chamber felt it. This wasn't courtroom procedure anymore. This was the sound of the system cracking open from the inside. As the envelope seal broke and its contents were slowly drawn into the light, the illusion of order gave way to the unmistakable scent of fear. Because what lay inside wasn't just evidence, it was exposure. Justice Clarence Thomas unfolded the first page with hands that had once signed landmark decisions without so much as a tremor. But this time the tremor came fast. It was a Department of Justice internal audit report, stamped confidential, dated 3 months before any charges were filed. The header read, "Preliminary findings, Hope Forward Initiative, donor classification discrepancies." As he read further, the courtroom seemed to constrict. The audit clearly and unequivocally stated that the financial irregularities in the Hope Forward program had originated from a third-party data software vendor, an automated back-end tool used to categorize donor data. It was a system error, not fraud, not deception, and certainly not Jasmine Crockett's doing. The report concluded that Representative Crockett had no administrative access, no oversight authority, and no prior awareness of the misclassification. She was, in the audit's words, a legislative sponsor, not an operational actor. Thomas blinked, his jaw stiffening. The audit alone was enough to unravel the case. But then he turned the page, and the oxygen seemed to leave the room. A second document emerged, not an audit, not a form, an email thread, internal DOJ correspondence, names redacted, but headers intact. Subject line, Crockett Optics. His eyes scanned the first line, and his lips parted in disbelief. "If we don't move on her now, she'll dominate midterms. Use donor confusion. Public won't question a fine. The media will fill in the blanks. His hand paused. There were more. Another DOJ official had responded, Thomas will give the ruling teeth. A Supreme Court name kills the backlash. Timing matters. Get it done before October. A single low gasp echoed from the press gallery. Someone dropped a pen. Another reporter stood frozen mid-type, their fingers hovering inches above the keyboard. It wasn't just evidence of a cover-up. It was a coordinated operation. Weaponized optics, systemic manipulation, and a deliberate plan to destroy a public servant for political convenience. Justice Thomas's fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope. His eyes, bloodshot now, scanned the gallery, then slowly returned to the page. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. This was never about justice. His hands shook. For the first time in over 30 years on the bench, the robe felt heavy. Not with honor, but with guilt. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply watched as the truth did what no protest, no speech, and no plea could ever accomplish. It cracked the marble throne beneath him. The air was thick with exposed truth. Every eye fixed on the man who had driven the dagger, now choking on its recoil. Malcolm Reed, once the golden boy of high-profile prosecutions, the man who dined with senators and grinned through Sunday talk shows, now sat frozen in his chair, blinking furiously as if sheer willpower could unsee what had just been laid bare. His fingers hovered over his files like they no longer knew how to hold paper. One folder slipped from his grasp and tumbled onto the courtroom floor with a slap loud enough to make people flinch. Loose documents spilled out in a pathetic scatter. Charts, headlines, exhibit notes, all of it now meaningless, like kindling after a flood. He reached for them on instinct, but his hand shook so badly he only succeeded in crumpling a corner. A low gasp came from his assistant, who leaned in, whispering something with urgency. Perhaps strategy, perhaps mercy. But Reed couldn't register it. He waved her off blindly, eyes still locked on the desk as if the wood grain might offer him a way out. He was pale now, not with embarrassment, but with collapse. The camera lights that had once loved him now felt like interrogation lamps. His chest rose too fast. Sweat pooled at his temples. The once proud silk tie around his neck twisted awkwardly, like it too wanted to flee the body it adorned. A man built for sound bites now couldn't summon a single word. Not because he had none, but because everything he might say would only dig the hole deeper. Across the bench, Justice Clarence Thomas had seen enough. He sat straighter, his black robe rippling slightly as he leaned forward. Not like a judge questioning a point of law, but like a man peering over the edge of something broken. His voice emerged slowly, each word pulled not from protocol, but from fury restrained by duty. Mr. Reed, he said, and the entire room stopped breathing. Even the courtroom lights seemed to hum quieter, as if the building itself was bracing for impact. Do you have anything to say before I proceed? It wasn't just a question. It was a final door creaking open, a last chance for dignity before the fall became permanent. And yet Reed, Harvard-trained, media-groomed, master of controlled narrative, said nothing. His mouth parted. No sound. His throat tightened. Still silence. Not even a whisper of defense. It wasn't that he didn't know how to spin it. It was that there was no spin left. The foundation beneath him, his arguments, his strategy, his power, had been built on buried evidence and manufactured doubt. And now the burial site had been dug up. Live. On camera. The silence stretched. Long enough for the nation watching to realize they were witnessing something rare. Not just a legal failure, but the public unraveling of a man who had confused ambition for justice. Not just shame, not just fear, but the dawning recognition that he had been used, and willingly so. Used by a machine bigger than himself to bring down a woman who simply refused to play by the rules of deference and silence. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her stillness said more than any celebration could. Across the aisle, her silence stood in perfect contrast to Reed's collapse. Where he scrambled, she endured. Where he broke, she waited. And that contrast between the woman who'd been falsely accused and the man who'd built the lie was now visible to the entire country. The courtroom was no longer a legal venue. It had become a mirror. And in that mirror, Malcolm Reed could no longer find the man he thought he was. With Reed's silence, the courtroom turned to the only man left with power, and for the first time in the entire hearing, Clarence Thomas looked like someone who no longer wanted it. Justice Thomas stood, not quickly, not grandly, but slowly, as if the very act of rising from the bench now carried the weight of consequence far greater than any ruling he had ever delivered. His palms pressed against the edge of the dark oak table, knuckles whitening, arms shaking ever so slightly. For decades, he had ruled from a place above the fray, untouchable, unreadable, immovable. But now the mask had cracked. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion, swept across the courtroom. Not as a judge, but as a man standing in the wreckage of something he had helped build. When he spoke, the sound was not thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, low, and controlled. The voice of someone who had walked through fire and come out not proud, but scorched. This court, he began, pausing as his throat tightened, finds the judgment of $500 million levied against Representative Jasmine Crockett to be unjustified, procedurally compromised, and legally unsound. He inhaled deeply, not for drama, but to keep his voice from breaking. As of this moment, he continued, eyes locked forward, that judgment is vacated, nullified, erased. It no longer stands. Gasps echoed, audible, uncontrollable. In the press gallery, pens froze mid-sentence. A journalist dropped their phone. Even Jasmine's legal team, stoic until now, couldn't mask the flicker of shock that moved across their faces. But Jasmine herself remained still. Not in disbelief, in focus, because she had known the truth all along. What surprised her wasn't the reversal, it was the fact that the reversal came from him. Justice Thomas looked down at the table, almost as if ashamed to meet the eyes of the woman he had just tried to destroy. This should have never reached my bench, he said quietly, and yet it did. He looked up again, now with fire slowly returning to his posture. Not anger, but clarity. What this court has seen today is not merely the revelation of evidence, he said. It is the exposure of a pattern, one that suggests a deliberate effort within the Department of Justice to suppress truth in favor of narrative, one that weaponized the appearance of law to manufacture political defeat. The words cut like blades, but this time they weren't aimed at Jasmine. They were aimed at the very institution that had sent her here. I was used, he said plainly. The room stiffened. My name, my bench, my robe, used to launder a lie. He stepped out from behind the desk now, moving around it with slow, deliberate steps. This was no longer a ruling, it was a reckoning. I do not offer excuses, he said, but I do offer this. I will not allow this institution, one meant to protect the powerless, to be turned into a hammer for the powerful. Not again, not under my watch. He returned to the center of the chamber and turned to face both the defense and prosecution tables. Therefore, he continued, effective immediately, I am authorizing a formal judicial inquiry, an open and independent review, into the conduct of the Department of Justice related to this case, and others in which exculpatory evidence may have been withheld or manipulated. A wave of stunned murmurs swept the room. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. A court officer dropped their pen. No one had expected this, not even Jasmine, because this wasn't just a ruling in her favor. It was a signal that the shield of power had cracked open from the inside. Justice Thomas turned back toward the bench and rested one hand on it again. Not as a master of the room, but as a man who had finally stepped out of shadow. This court, he said slowly, is not adjourned, because this hearing is no longer about one woman's guilt or innocence. It is now about the system that put her here. A long silence followed, not the awkward silence of uncertainty, but the heavy silence that falls right before the storm. This wasn't the end of a trial, it was the beginning of an investigation. And this time, the accused wasn't Jasmine Crockett. It was everything that had tried to bury her. Justice had cracked the surface, but Jasmine knew better than to mistake a crack for a cure. What was exposed yesterday had been buried for years, And if she didn't act now, it would simply learn how to hide better. At precisely 9:31 a.m., the doors of the old federal building's East Conference Room opened, not with fanfare, but with a quiet that hummed with anticipation. Reporters filed in, elbow to elbow, their faces lit more by tension than camera light. They weren't there for spin. They were there for something rarer, the aftermath of truth. There was no staging, no campaign flags or handlers. Just one podium, one mic, and Jasmine Crockett standing alone beneath a bare fluorescent light like a witness testifying before the nation. Her expression wasn't stern. It was clear, like polished stone after rain. No makeup touch-ups, no smile for the cameras. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning in plain language. She didn't open with pleasantries. She didn't thank the press. She just began. "If you're expecting fury," she said, her voice measured and low, "you won't find it here today. If you're expecting revenge, look elsewhere. I didn't survive what happened yesterday to shout at a podium. I'm here to deliver the one thing that almost cost me everything. The truth." The room stilled. Boom mics crept forward. Even the skeptical, the cynical, the disillusioned in the back of the room leaned in. Not because she was loud, but because she refused to flinch. "My name was dragged through the mud," she said calmly. "My reputation was nearly destroyed. I stood trial without evidence. I was sentenced without argument. And the system, your system, my system, was ready to bury me under $500 million. Because I wouldn't play by the rules they never wrote down, but always enforced." A murmur rippled through the room. Some looked down. Others looked stunned. Jasmine let the silence breathe, then pressed forward. "I'm still standing," she said, quieter now, "but I refuse to be the exception. I didn't walk out of that courtroom just to clear my name. I walked out to make sure the next person never has to stand where I stood, with nothing but a spine and the hope that someone, somewhere, would still care about facts." She adjusted the single sheet of paper in her hand. No script, just a handwritten outline in blue ink, and looked straight ahead. "So today, I'm introducing 3 reform proposals. Not because they're easy, but because they are necessary. And because if Congress won't act, the people will know who stayed silent." She held up one finger. "First, a law mandating the full and immediate disclosure of exculpatory evidence. No more withholding. No more, we'll deliver it later. If the government has information that proves your innocence, it goes on the record. Immediately, non-negotiable. Because hiding the truth is not a legal strategy, it's a crime." That last sentence landed like a hammer. Some in the back gasped. Others scribbled as if racing against history. She held up a second finger. "Second, real whistleblower protection, not symbolic, not buried in subclauses, real. Legal immunity from retaliation, independent channels, emergency legal defense funds. Because no one should have to choose between their conscience and their career, and no public servant should ever lose sleep wondering if exposing corruption will cost them everything. The truth should not be a suicide mission." You could hear a pin drop. In that moment, the political theater of Washington felt far away, because this didn't sound like a press conference. It sounded like a woman reading the terms of battle. She raised a third and final finger. Third, a bipartisan judicial oversight council, permanent, independent, with teeth, appointed equally by both parties, empowered to investigate misconduct by judges, prosecutors, and federal agencies. No more immunity cloaked in robes. No more hiding behind procedure. If someone manipulates justice for political gain, they will be named, they will be investigated, and they will be held accountable in daylight. She stepped back slightly, letting those final words sink like anchors into the room. No one clapped. No one dared to. This wasn't that kind of moment, and yet her silence after that final proposal spoke louder than any slogan. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't soften her stance to win favor. Because this wasn't about charisma. It was about clarity. Steel wrapped in civility. Fire behind glass. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but the kind of whisper you remember forever. "Yesterday, I was the one on trial. Today, I'm here to put the system on notice. We are not afraid. We are not confused. And we are not going anywhere. One final beat passed. Then she stepped away from the microphone. No theatrics, no victory lap. Only the sound of quiet conviction in the start of something unstoppable. The truth had been spoken. But in America, even truth needs a megaphone. And just when Jasmine's voice began to ripple, the world got something louder than her words. A confession caught on tape. It began as a file no one expected. Just another anonymous upload in a corner of the internet crowded with noise. The file name was plain: DOJMT call internal 721 final. No tags, no description, just a blurry thumbnail and a runtime of 4 minutes and 32 seconds. A low-level researcher for a watchdog nonprofit happened to click it during a late-night scroll, expecting bureaucratic monotony. What she heard instead made her sit upright, then stand. On screen, a half-dozen Justice Department officials filled a virtual meeting window, unaware, or perhaps arrogantly indifferent, to the fact that their conversation was being recorded. Their voices were casual, their expressions tired but calm. The tone was not one of urgency, but of certainty. And then came the sentence. Carl Hensley, Deputy Director of DOJ Public Affairs, leaned back in his chair and spoke without blinking. We need to move now. If we don't neutralize Crockett before the midterms, she's going to become unstoppable. She's media fluent, reform-minded, and, worst of all, undeniably clean. She'll own the narrative, unless we take her out before she has a platform. No one objected. A woman off-screen laughed nervously. Clarify? Take her out? How? He didn't miss a beat. Leak something. Invent something. It's not hard. You saw what we did with Hope Forward? Run the numbers, find the holes, bury the truth in paperwork. People won't check. People want clean headlines. Give them a villain, not a verdict. Another official interrupted, concerned. Wait, are we still recording this? 5 seconds of silence followed. 5 seconds of blinking, frozen faces. Then someone cursed. The screen went black. The file hit X, formerly Twitter, by 7:38 a.m. Eastern. By 8:05, it had been reposted 40,000 times. By 9 a.m., every major news outlet was running it on loop. It bypassed politics. It bypassed race. It bypassed debate. It was raw evidence, a digital bullet, fired not at Jasmine Crockett, but at the very heart of American justice. The hashtags # DOJ conspiracy, # Crockett was set up, and # they said neutralize her trended in over 30 countries. TikTok exploded with split-screen reactions. Veterans in tears, lawyers seething, students stunned into silence. On Reddit, legal experts broke down federal code line by line, explaining how many laws had just been shattered in one call. People weren't asking for accountability. They were demanding it with fire in their veins. Protests erupted in over a dozen cities by nightfall, not because they were organized, but because they were inevitable. In D.C., demonstrators surrounded the Department of Justice with signs reading, "She spoke, they schemed," and "Whistleblowers save nations." In Dallas, someone painted Jasmine's face 8 feet high on the side of a courthouse wall with the words, "Truth survives." Inside the halls of Congress, the mood changed like a flip breaker. Silence turned to panic. Backdoor whispers became urgent strategy sessions. Members of both parties realized this wasn't a political problem. It was a constitutional one. At 6:14 p.m., the House Oversight Committee called an emergency session. By unanimous bipartisan vote, an anomaly in the modern era, they authorized public hearings into misconduct, conspiracy, and obstruction inside the DOJ. The subpoenas flew fast. Carl Hensley was placed on unpaid leave within the hour. By the time he exited the DOJ's front entrance, cameras were waiting, clicking like gunfire. His jaw clenched. He said nothing. Reporters shouted over each other, "Did you mean to say it? Was the trial against Jasmine Crockett rigged? Do you regret anything?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because the nation already had the answer. By morning, 3 senior DOJ officials were suspended pending investigation. Anonymous sources confirmed more were coming. The Inspector General launched a full-scale internal audit, and Senate hearings were announced for the following week. The New York Times front-page headline read, "DOJ on trial." The Washington Post followed with, "She was right." But the most shared headline came from a small independent outlet that had followed Jasmine's journey from the beginning. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive, she triggered the reckoning. This wasn't just fallout, it was a tectonic shift. Because for the first time in a long time, the American public had seen exactly how truth is buried. They had heard the voices, they had watched the silence, and they had felt the system crack, not from the outside, but from within. And in the center of it all stood a woman they had tried to erase. Not louder than her enemies, but more unshakable than their lies. The hearings exposed the rot. The footage lit the fire. But it was Jasmine's pen, steady, relentless, unshaking, that carved reform out of the ashes. It was introduced on a Monday morning with no press conference, no polished rollout. Just a single-page draft slid onto the desk of the House Judiciary Committee like a legal grenade. Its title was unassuming, the Transparent Justice Act. But the language within read like a declaration of war against everything the system had weaponized against her. Every line of the bill was forged in the fire Jasmine had just walked through. No abstractions, no legal gymnastics, just raw clarity. Section 1. Immediate and mandatory disclosure of all exculpatory evidence in any federal case, regardless of political implications or prosecutorial convenience. Section 2. Felony-level penalties for any federal official who knowingly suppresses such evidence. Section 3. The creation of an independent oversight council, free from party appointments, with full investigatory power over DOJ and federal courts. It wasn't written in flowery rhetoric. It read like a scalpel. Opponents expected her to stumble, to grandstand, to politicize. But Jasmine didn't come to Washington to play defense. She came to build a firewall for herself and for anyone who'd ever been railroaded in the shadows. When she introduced the bill on the floor, she didn't pound the podium. She didn't raise her voice. She said with devastating calm, "If they could do it to me, with cameras watching and a title before my name, what do you think they're doing to people who have nothing but their name?" A silence spread like a wave. Even those who had once mocked her as too bold, too angry, or too much, sat back in their chairs and listened, not out of courtesy, but because something in her voice refused to be ignored. What followed was not politics. It was momentum. Jasmine became the lightning rod for a movement that had no leader until that moment. Civil rights organizations, whistleblower groups, veterans coalitions, and legal associations all lined up behind the bill. Conservative think tanks called it painfully necessary. Liberal watchdogs labeled it the first real reform in decades. Voters, millions of them, lit up the phone lines of their representatives. Offices were overwhelmed. One junior staffer leaked a screenshot of a constituent inbox titled, "You vote no, you're done." Inside Congress, the resistance collapsed like a brittle wall. Senators who had privately whispered doubts about the optics now gave floor speeches quoting Jasmine word for word. House members who once kept their distance from her were now begging to co-sponsor. The bill cleared committee with a unanimous vote. It passed the House 412 to 23. The Senate, famously gridlocked, famously slow, voted 92 to 8 in favor. One senator, known for rarely backing reform, was asked by reporters why he flipped. His answer was simple. "I saw what they tried to do to her, and I saw how she responded." When the bill reached the White House, the signing ceremony was unlike any in recent memory. No balloons, no fanfare, just a single desk in the Rose Garden. The president sat with the Transparent Justice Act before him and motioned for Jasmine to stand beside him. Cameras rolled, staffers held their breath. Jasmine didn't reach for the pen. She didn't need to. She let the moment breathe. She stood still, unblinking, as the president signed her bill into law and then handed her the pen. She accepted it with both hands, not as a trophy, but as a promise. She said only one sentence. No applause line. No victory lap. "This is not a win. This is a warning. A warning to the next official who thinks they can rig a courtroom. A warning to the next prosecutor who weighs optics over evidence. A warning to a system that has, for too long, thrived in shadows and silence." Her words landed like steel striking stone, and the ripples didn't fade. That sentence would be quoted in legal textbooks, printed on protest signs, tattooed on forearms. And just like that, the Transparent Justice Act became law, 60 days after Jasmine's name was nearly erased by it all. In a country drowning in gridlock, fear, and division, one woman turned a personal crucifixion into national transformation. She didn't do it by shouting, she did it by surviving, and then refusing to stop there. The law had passed, the headlines had quieted, and cable networks still begged for her face. But Jasmine Crockett slipped out of Washington like a rumor refusing to be monetized. She turned down every invitation, from morning talk shows eager for a redemption arc to primetime pundits hungry to frame her as either savior or threat. And instead she rented a scuffed white sedan and drove south on Interstate 35, as if fleeing a storm no radar could trace. She reached South Dallas at dusk, parking outside the same cinderblock community center where she'd once volunteered to help teens expunge minor records the city refused to erase. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax and old basketballs, the fluorescent lights buzzing like tired bees. She unfolded a plastic chair, sat at a wobbling card table, and opened a spiral notebook to a blank page. Word traveled fast. No press releases, just text chains and whispered disbelief. And by nightfall, a line of neighbors stretched out the door. A single mother balancing two jobs and a broken childcare voucher, a laid-off mechanic whose disability claim had stalled, a high school senior clutching rejection letters, and a dream deferred. Jasmine listened, pen moving in quiet loops, asking questions no reporter had bothered with. What did the eviction notice actually say? Who at the DMV kept losing your paperwork? Which judge had dismissed your wage theft complaint without explanation? At 10 p.m., the building's heater rattled off, and her breath curled in front of her, yet she kept writing until her ink ran dry, promising nothing except the truth that someone was finally listening. When the custodian flicked the lights, she helped stack chairs, tucked her notes into an envelope, and walked out beneath a sky the color of bruised steel, unnoticed except by a cat perched on a busted railing. She drove to a budget motel off Loop 12, ate a stale granola bar, and studied her notes until her eyelids burned. Because victory speeches don't fix cracked sidewalks or close clinics. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, an idea took shape, fragile and luminous. Maybe the real legacy of a courtroom battle isn't the statute it births, but the faith it resurrects in people who long ago stopped believing anyone in power could hear them. The next afternoon, she was in Jackson, Mississippi, standing outside a storm-battered church whose steeple leaned like a question mark against the gray sky. Folding chairs formed an imperfect circle on the cracked asphalt. Jasmine took the last empty seat, coat draped over her knees, as a veterans support group began trading stories of lost benefits and folded flags. A man with a prosthetic leg described waiting 9 months for a replacement socket. A woman who'd served in Desert Storm said her PTSD claim had been denied because her medical records were misplaced. Jasmine didn't interrupt, didn't flash a business card, didn't mention the Transparent Justice Act. She simply wrote, nodding to show she heard each detail, her silence sharper than any speech. When the stories wound down, an older veteran in a faded 82nd Airborne cap leaned forward, eyes glassy, and asked, "You gonna run for president now that you saved the system?" A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but Jasmine shook her head and said, "I didn't save the system. I just proved it bleeds." The circle fell quiet. The veteran reached across the gap, weathered hand trembling, and squeezed hers. "You did what we thought nobody dared do anymore," he whispered, voice rough with years of dust and diesel. Phones should have captured it, but no reporters were there. Only the creak of folding metal and the slow breath of people daring to hope. That night, someone spray-painted those words on an abandoned factory wall downtown. By morning, photos of the makeshift mural had traveled farther than any network segment could reach. And yet Jasmine stayed invisible to the algorithms, refusing to trend, because transformation, she believed, grows best where cameras don't trample the soil. A week later, she found herself in Flint, Michigan, seated at a Formica table in a shuttered corner store, repurposed as a pop-up legal clinic. The winter wind rattled plywood sheets over broken windows, but inside the light of 3 space heaters glowed like embers around a circle of elderly residents clutching bottled water. They told her about rashes that wouldn't fade, children's teeth crumbling, houses still worthless after a crisis the news cycle had long since abandoned. Jasmine listened, jaw tight, knuckles white around a styrofoam cup gone cold. One grandmother described paying 2 utility bills, one for poison water she feared to use, another for jugs she drove 6 miles to purchase, while debit card fees ate into her Social Security check. Jasmine wrote every number, every date, every name of every official who had promised relief and delivered none. A volunteer offered her a microphone for Facebook Live, but she declined, saying, "They've shared their pain enough. Today I'm here to carry it, not broadcast it." When the session ended, she boxed 2 folders of affidavits, taped them shut, and mailed them overnight to the new oversight council her law had created, adding a sticky note that read, Case 001, Flint. Before leaving, she knelt beside a young mother whose toddler coughed in jagged bursts and whispered, "I can't promise speed, but I can promise daylight." The woman wept into her sleeve. Jasmine's own eyes burned, but she stood, shoulders squared, and stepped back into the cold. Because duty isn't a cape, it's a weight you choose to keep lifting. Stories like these multiplied until Jasmine's notebooks filled a suitcase. Eviction stats from Baltimore, bail bond gouging in New Orleans, ICE hold errors in Bakersfield, courthouse interpreter shortages in Flagstaff. She moved quietly, swapping rental cars weekly, paying cash for motel rooms, shunning the entourage a security advisor insisted she hire. Sometimes she woke before dawn to run through unfamiliar streets, lungs aching, mind cataloging patterns. Which communities lacked legal aid? Which judges repeated the same creditor-friendly rulings? Which police districts dismissed whistleblowers for daring to log evidence into the wrong bin? Each night she typed a summary under the same heading, "When the powerful shake because the truth stands tall," and emailed it to the Oversight Council's public archive, daring them to leave her reports unread. And though trolls online mocked her for playing Mother Teresa, real change began to stir. A county clerk in Georgia reinstated 300 expunged records after her inquiry. A Midwest hospital reversed its policy on billing unpaid rape kit fees. A Texas judge recused himself from eviction court after her dossier proved he owned stock in the property management firm, filing half the cases. None of it made national news. That was by design. Jasmine didn't need applause. She needed precedent. One rainy evening in Houston, at a community potluck held under a leaking gym roof, a frail woman with silver braids shuffled forward, using a walker whose wheels squealed on slick concrete. Jasmine rose to pull out a chair, but the woman shook her head and lifted a trembling hand. "Sit," she insisted. Jasmine obeyed. The woman grasped her fingers, skin paper thin but grip iron strong, and said, voice soft yet carrying through the echoing hall, "Child, you did something we feared was extinct. You made the powerful tremble." People nearby fell silent. Even the children chasing a deflated basketball stopped to listen. "Promise me," the woman continued, "you'll keep that courage alive, because if truth doesn't stand, we got nothing left." Jasmine swallowed hard, throat tight, and answered, "The courage is yours, I'm just passing it forward." Someone recorded the exchange on a shaky phone, but by morning the clip had been reposted thousands of times. The final line captioned in white letters, "When the powerful tremble because truth stands tall, that's when justice begins." Law students stenciled it onto dorm walls. A professor in Vermont opened every lecture with the quote. A legal aid office in Oakland painted it above their reception desk. It spread not like a slogan, but like a compass bearing, pointing to a north most people had forgotten existed. By summer, journalists finally traced Jasmine to a dusty town outside Tulsa, where she was helping organize pro bono representation for Native families battling pipeline seizures. Cameras arrived in a frenzy, but she stepped aside, directing them to elders whose land deeds dated back to 1905. When a correspondent asked why she still refused primetime interviews, she answered with a weary smile, "Because the story was never me. The story is what happens when everyday voices chain themselves together and refuse to whisper." He pressed her, asking whether she'd run for higher office, whether she feared fading from relevance. Jasmine closed her notebook, looked him in the eye and said, Relevance is a mirror the powerful hold up to themselves. I'm here to build windows. That line led the evening broadcast, yet she declined their offer of a follow-up, opting instead to spend the night drafting a grant proposal for a mobile legal clinic housed in a retrofitted city bus. Grants didn't trend, but they changed lives. Late one October afternoon, Jasmine returned to the South Dallas Community Center, where it had all begun. The same custodian, now wearing a freshly pressed uniform, greeted her with a broad smile and a handshake that lasted longer than protocol. Inside, rows of new computers glowed under LED lights, funded by a settlement her evidence had helped secure. Teenagers edited resumes Jasmine's staff had taught them to write, while a small plaque above the entrance quoted the words that had traveled the nation. She sat on a plastic chair, knees aching from months on the road, and watched an 11-year-old boy teach his grandmother how to send her first email. A volunteer offered to announce her presence over the PA system. Jasmine declined. She exhaled, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness, and realized this: quiet connection, uninvented hope, was the victory no verdict could award. Her phone buzzed with yet another network request. She silenced it without reading. Fame is loud, she thought, but justice flourishes in whispers shared around chipped tables. That night, as she drove toward a horizon painted purple by city lights, her radio picked up a college station debating the new constitutional amendments her act had inspired. A caller quoted the mural, "When the powerful tremble." Jasmine smiled, but her eyes stayed on the road. There were more towns to visit, more stories to witness, more truths to anchor. She gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale, resolute as asphalt stretched ahead. The system could adapt, hide, rebrand, but it would never again forget the sound of its own marble cracking under the steady weight of one woman's unshakable calm. And somewhere, in a law class she would never meet, a student underlined that quote for the 10th time, feeling something flicker back to life. A conviction that justice wasn't an institution, but a stance. Jasmine Crockett drove on, headlights carving through darkness, carrying that stance in the quiet beat of her heart. Proof that the mighty can tremble, and the truth, once it stands, doesn't kneel again. The cameras faded, the crowds dispersed, and what remained was not the spectacle of victory, but the quiet question every witness now had to answer. What does Jasmine Crockett's fight mean for the rest of us? The first lesson rises like smoke from the rubble of her trial. Justice is never a fixed monument, but a battlefield that must be reclaimed every generation. And the moment we assume the law will guard itself, it can be hijacked by those who sharpen statutes into spears. Jasmine's ordeal teaches that silence in the face of administrative convenience or institutional arrogance is complicity, for the system did not simply malfunction. It conspired, calculating optics over evidence, hoping the public would trade curiosity for outrage. Yet it shattered the instant one woman demanded receipts, proving that even the most fortified deception unravels when confronted by relentless fact-finding. Her stand warns us that power respects neither innocence nor merit without sustained pressure, and that due process is meaningless if the people inside the courthouse do not fear accountability. Therefore, the human duty is vigilance, the daily discipline of reading past headlines, of questioning sealed files, of refusing to let legal jargon drown moral sense. It is our obligation to remember that constitutions may enshrine rights, but only citizens can animate them, and every unchecked corner of governance becomes a breeding ground for quiet tyranny. Above all, this chapter screams that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to barter truth for personal safety, because intimidation tactics, be they billion-dollar fines or whispered threats, work only when we believe we stand alone. The second lesson glows in the aftermath like a fuse still burning. Stories change policy faster than statistics ever will, and the human narrative, fierce, flawed, unmistakably real, is the lever that moves legislative stone. Jasmine could have recited chart after chart on prosecutorial misconduct, yet nothing pierced hearts until the nation watched her dignity being auctioned in open court. So we learn that empathy is the engine of reform, that people rally when injustice is incarnated in a face, a voice, a trembling hand. It reminds advocates that data must wear flesh to matter, that behind every percentage point lies a grandmother's eviction, a veteran's unpaid claim, a child's shattered future. The moral recoil triggered by that leaked DOJ clip proved facts alone are inert until fused with human context. And once fused, they ignite with unstoppable heat. Thus, the citizen's calling is to bear witness and retell what institutions would prefer to redact. Because darkness retreats less from argument than from exposure. Each of us carries a story, our own or one entrusted to us, and the Republic depends on our willingness to lift that story high enough to be seen, even when our knees shake. In that lifting, we discover solidarity, for outrage multiplies when shared, turning singular pain into collective resolve, an alchemy Jasmine mastered and then handed to the masses like a torch. The third lesson breathes through her refusal of celebrity. Authentic leadership rejects the narcotic of applause, choosing instead the slow, grinding labor of listening. For real power is not measured by how many microphones beg for your soundbite, but by how many unheard voices you amplify. Jasmine turned her back on lucrative booking fees because she understood that hero worship freezes progress at the moment of triumph, trapping reform inside a personality cult, while true change demands leaders who step aside so communities can step forward. Her plastic chair pilgrimages model a politics rooted in proximity, the belief that policy drafted without sitting in the cold with those it serves will always calcify into performative pity. She teaches that travel to the margins is mandatory, that empathy cannot be phoned in from a green room, and that legislation untested by kitchen table confession will crumble at first contact with reality. In following her footsteps, we're challenged to exchange performative outrage for practical solidarity, answering emails from strangers, attending local hearings, translating legalese for neighbors who have never stepped inside a courthouse. She exposes the lie that complex problems require distant experts alone, showing instead that solutions bloom when the governed co-author the governing. Her humility reframes success, not a spotlight's glare, but the soft affirmation in an elder's eyes when she whispers, "You made the powerful tremble." The fourth lesson hammers like a drumbeat under every scene. Institutions reform not from constructed civility, but from sustained disruption, and disruption begins with whistleblowers who risk livelihood for the liberty of strangers. Jasmine's vindication hinged on a single envelope slipped through a crack in the wall, proving that history sometimes pivots on anonymous courage. Yet that bravery withers without communal scaffolding, so her Transparent Justice Act codifies sanctuary for truth-tellers, reminding us that moral ecosystems require legal armor. In this, we grasp our shared responsibility to defend those who speak inconvenient facts, sharing their stories, crowdfunding their defenses, voting out officials who retaliate in darkness. The humane duty is to build a culture where secrecy is shameful and transparency an expectation, not an exception, because sunlight delayed is justice denied. Every workplace, every agency, every boardroom hides someone weighing the cost of revelation tonight. And Jasmine's saga pleads with us to make that cost bearable, to be the network that catches the leper before the machinery of retaliation can crush them. Our collective future depends on treating whistleblowers not as traitors, but as guardians of the social contract. The fifth lesson surfaces in her quiet mantra. Truth stands, power shakes, and it challenges our definition of victory. The goal is not the humiliation of adversaries, but the realignment of systems toward fairness, for vengeance might satisfy the wounded ego, yet leave structures intact. Jasmine accepted Thomas's tearful reversal not as triumph over a man, but as leverage to indict the machinery behind him, converting personal redemption into systemic reckoning. She models the discipline of rejecting easy vindication, press tours, bestseller deals, partisan weaponization, in favor of painstaking reform that endures after the cameras pack up. The humanist takeaway is that justice transcends personalities, that a society matures when it stops celebrating fallen villains and starts redesigning the stage that birthed them. In practical terms, it means demanding audits, rewriting rules, funding oversight instead of parades. It urges us to track results, flipped convictions, reopened cases, budgets shifted toward public defenders, because symbolism without metrics is sentiment masquerading as progress. Each citizen inherits the duty to measure change, to keep receipts, to refuse to let momentum dissipate into nostalgia. The sixth lesson pulses through her cross-country listening tour. Proximity to pain is a curriculum no ivory tower can replicate, teaching that reform authored in marble halls must be field-tested in neighborhoods where streetlights flicker. Jasmine's nights in motels and mornings in union halls reveal injustice as a mosaic of local indignities. Water bills, bail fees, zoning laws, magnified into national crisis. We learn that democracy thrives when policymakers log miles, not media minutes, when they collect anecdotes with the rigor of scholars and return with solutions tailored like handmade shoes. She proves that dignity is restored not by federal proclamations alone, but by a legislator sitting on a stoop explaining a new form in plain language. Her example calls each of us to shrink the distance between our daily routines and the communities bleeding under our policies, volunteering at eviction court, attending school board meetings, translating ballot guides. In doing so, we dismantle the myth that government is a distant monolith, rediscovering it as a mirror of collective engagement. The seventh lesson gleams in the murals and lecture hall quotes: symbols matter, words endure, and a single sentence can outlive 1,000 press releases. When the powerful tremble because truth stands tall, that's when justice begins, has become more than graffiti. It's a liturgy recited by law students before moot court finals, a banner hanging in public defender offices, a screen print on protest banners from Atlanta to Anchorage. Jasmine's story reminds storytellers, teachers, parents that language is ammunition in the fight for equity, able to rally despairing hearts and crystallize diffuse anger into disciplined action. It challenges each of us to craft our own justice mantra, brief enough to fit on a bus bench, yet deep enough to steer a movement. Because movements sustain on repetition, and repetition shapes memory, and memory anchors accountability. Celebrate phrases that summon courage. Distribute them like seeds. Paint them where children can't miss them. In time, they will germinate in legislative chambers, corporate boardrooms, jury deliberations. Finally, the eighth lesson, perhaps the fiercest, lurks in her refusal to claim a pedestal. Leadership is a relay, not a throne, and the torch must keep moving lest the flame become decoration. Jasmine's journey sparks countless successors: the single mother who now speaks at city council, the veteran who organizes claim clinics, the law student launching a whistleblower hotline. Her legacy insists we stop outsourcing courage to public figures and instead locate it in ourselves, repeating her quiet creed. The system changes when ordinary people decide they're tired of praying for someone else to save them. This ethos dismantles the spectatorship that politics too often breeds, inviting each witness to graduate from audience to actor. The fight ahead, against algorithmic bias, prison profiteering, environmental apartheid, requires armies of Jasmines, each carrying a piece of the broader load. So the narrative closes not with a statue but with an empty space beside her plastic chair, waiting for the next person to sit, listen, and act. The story's final charge is clear. Pick up the notebook, join the circle, write the next chapter. Because justice, like a muscle, only grows when ordinary hands refuse to let it atrophy in silence. And so the human lesson crystallizes. When institutions quake and headlines fade, the measure of a society is not whether it crowns new heroes, but whether it multiplies everyday guardians of truth. People who, armed with empathy and evidence, stand so firmly that even the mighty cannot help but tremble. But what good is a lesson if it stays trapped on a mural, in a headline, or behind the courtroom door? Now it's your turn. This isn't just Jasmine Crockett's story, it's a warning and a weapon. If you felt rage watching her silenced, if your hands clenched when the truth was buried beneath a $500 million lie, then don't just remember it, respond. This system doesn't change by accident. It bends only when enough people pull at it. Call your representatives, demand transparency laws with real teeth, show up at town halls and ask where your local judges stand on accountability. Support whistleblowers, volunteer legal aid hours, start community oversight groups. And if you've been silent until now, speak, because silence is what lets this machine keep grinding people like Jasmine into dust. Be louder than the gavels meant to shut you down. Because here's the truth. Injustice doesn't fear outrage. It fears organization. And the next time a courtroom tries to crucify truth to protect power, it shouldn't just be one woman standing. It should be all of us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just 5 explosive minutes inside Capitol Room 2141, Jasmine Crockett exposed how Chief Justice John Roberts ignored years of undisclosed financial ties between a sitting Supreme Court justice and political megadonors. Millions of people watched as his confidence collapsed. She backed every word with court records, donor trails, and cases that smelled like corruption. He tried to deflect. She didn't blink. And then she asked the one question that silenced the most powerful judge in America. What did Jasmine say that made the country freeze? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill had seen hundreds of hearings, but that morning was different. The air inside room 2141 was unnaturally still, like the breath before a storm, charged with something unspoken, something waiting to detonate. The hearing had been called under the banner of judicial ethics, a term so often diluted it barely registered with the press anymore. Most lawmakers leaned back in their seats, eyes glazed, fingers tapping phones under the table. The cameras had been set up with the expectation of dull exchanges, polite evasions, and legal jargon thick enough to choke a conversation. But then the name was called, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped. A few heads turned, then more. The quiet shuffle of papers stopped. Reporters lifted their eyes from screens, and across from them all, seated like a monument of tradition in a Navy suit polished with power, Chief Justice John Roberts didn't flinch, because he didn't know what was coming. Roberts had weathered storms before, scandals, criticisms, confirmation chaos, but nothing in his decades of navigating D.C. prepared him for the force now unfolding across the mahogany table. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk in like someone new to the room. She moved like someone who had nothing left to fear, like someone who had already been underestimated too many times and came to collect the cost. Her dark suit didn't shimmer, her heels didn't echo, but her presence cut like a blade honed in courtroom fire, sharpened by every man who had ever called her too loud or too ambitious. For her, this hearing wasn't about headlines or career moves. It was about justice dragged behind closed doors, about silence bought with power, and about the people she carried in every file folder she held. Across from her sat a man who believed the institution would shield him, but Crockett had come to remind the country. No one sits above the truth, not even the highest court in the land. He didn't know it yet, but the silence Jasmine Crockett carried into the room wasn't passive, it was pressure, it was memory. It was every courtroom where she'd watched poor men stand alone, judged by a system they never had the power to question. It was every time she was told to wait her turn, to stay in her lane, or to be more respectful of institutions that had never shown respect to people who looked like her. And now that silence was about to collide with the man who believed he could still speak above it. Chief Justice John Roberts adjusted his cuffs, then leaned forward with the ease of a man who'd done this before, too many times. Let me begin by reaffirming the integrity of this institution, he said, his voice low, deliberate, and smoothed over with the kind of polish only decades of power can afford. The Supreme Court has always operated under a code of conduct, even in the absence of a formal mandate. We understand the importance of public trust. He paused just long enough to let the statement settle, then continued. It is essential that we maintain the separation of powers. The judiciary must remain independent, not subjected to political influence or reactive policymaking. That is the foundation of our democracy. Words like integrity, objectivity, and historic precedent rolled off his tongue like marble statues being slid into place. But underneath the polish was something colder, an avoidance so precise it bordered on arrogance. Every answer was a shield. Every sentence was a dance away from responsibility. He didn't lie. He didn't need to. He just built a maze of legal phrasing so intricate, most people listening would never find the exit. Reporters barely looked up from their screens, typing out sanitized pull quotes. Cameras clicked at regular intervals, more interested in optics than substance. A few older committee members nodded along, half listening, used to the rhythm of these hearings, where nothing truly got asked and nothing truly got answered. It was a ritual. Robes untouchable, power undisrupted. Roberts knew this room. He thought he owned it. For years, he'd stood at the intersection of law and legacy, wrapped in the quiet confidence of a man protected by precedent. He believed this would be no different. Another performance, another checkmark. He had no idea that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for conversation. She had come for confrontation. And then it was her turn. He had no idea that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for conversation. She had come for confrontation. And as her microphone clicked on, it was no longer just a hearing, it was a reckoning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words came low and even, sharp and deliberate, like the calm before a controlled detonation. "Chief Justice," she began, her tone steady, eyes locked. "In your 2013 commencement address at Harvard, you said, and I quote, 'Your credibility is your currency. The moment people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses.'" A pause. The room stilled. Roberts didn't blink, but the echo of his own words hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. "So tell me," she continued, flipping a page in her folder, without looking down, "how does that credibility survive when just last year, a sitting justice failed to disclose financial connections to a party appearing before the court, and no one said a word?" The silence stretched. Then, just barely audible, the first camera shutter clicked. Someone shifted in their seat. This wasn't a freshman congresswoman reading from notes. This was a woman who had come prepared to cut through decades of ceremony with one surgical question at a time. Jasmine leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to underline the precision of her attack. "You've told this chamber before that the court holds itself to the highest ethical standards," she said, her voice still low, unhurried. "But where exactly do those standards exist if they're not written, not enforced, and not transparent?" She flipped to another document, this one bearing the seal of the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. "Your financial disclosure procedures leave it up to each justice to decide what matters." That's not oversight. That's honor code for the most powerful legal body in the country. She paused and looked up. "Where I'm from, an honor code doesn't mean much when lives are on the line." Behind her, aides and staffers sat frozen, not because she was loud, but because she was devastatingly exact. Her tone didn't accuse, it exposed. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but she raised one hand lightly, not to silence him, but to steer the moment back where it belonged. "I'm not done," she said, eyes unwavering, "because I want to make sure the people watching this understand what's at stake." She turned to the next page in her file and held it up slightly. "This is from the case Macon versus Delta Rail. Justice Harland, who, by the way, took 3 trips paid for by the very same parties involved in this matter, never recused himself, never even explained why. And yet the ruling came down 5-4 in their favor." She leaned back. "Now, Chief Justice, you can call that coincidence, but the people in my district call that corruption." The words dropped like a hammer, simple, unmistakable, unspinnable. For a moment, Roberts said nothing. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of the desk, a subtle tell of discomfort. His voice finally came, a notch less sure than before. "Congresswoman, while I respect your passion, I would caution against drawing conclusions from isolated incidents." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm not drawing conclusions," she said, voice cold as glass. "I'm drawing connections." The audience felt it, the shift. She wasn't just questioning Roberts. She was cracking the armor of untouchable power line by line. Then she pivoted, swift, seamless, deadly. "Let's talk about precedent," she said. "You like precedent, don't you, Chief Justice?" A rhetorical jab. Dalton v. Mason County, Fifth Circuit, 2009. A judge failed to recuse himself due to indirect financial ties. The ruling made it clear, even appearance of impropriety is grounds for removal. Not direct evidence, not scandal, just suspicion. She held up the opinion like it was an indictment. So why doesn't that same standard apply to your colleagues on the Supreme Court? No one answered, and she didn't expect them to. This wasn't a request for an explanation. This was a cross-examination. Her tone never rose, but the force behind her words grew heavier, like thunder rolling just beyond the walls. I've seen young men in Texas, black, brown, poor, get torn apart by judges for failing to report income they didn't know they had. I've watched mothers lose custody over a missed court date. And yet here, she said, gesturing broadly around the room, we're expected to believe that 9 people with lifetime appointments don't need rules, don't need oversight, because they wear the robe? She let that image hang. 9 people, lifetime power, no one watching. She didn't grandstand. She didn't pause for applause. She kept going like a surgeon mid-procedure, too focused to flinch. You say your credibility is your currency, she said, returning to his words. But let me ask you, what's left when that currency has been spent behind closed doors? What do the people see when their appeals vanish and billionaires win every time? Her voice dropped a half step. They see a court that no longer rules by principle. It rules by privilege. Someone in the room gasped, barely audible, but it was there. A staffer looked nervously at a reporter. The cameras were rolling, sure, but what they captured was more than an exchange. It was a shift in power. For the first time in the hearing, Roberts didn't answer, and Jasmine didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it grow, let it breathe, because sometimes silence is louder than anything a Chief Justice can say, and Jasmine Crockett knew exactly how to weaponize it. The silence Jasmine let hang in the room was not empty. It was loaded. It was the kind that demanded response, and Roberts knew it. But what he didn't know was that the next words out of his mouth would not restore control. They would surrender it. Chief Justice Roberts shifted in his seat, ever so slightly, but the movement spoke volumes. The stillness he had worn like a robe began to fray. He cleared his throat and leaned into the mic, the smooth polish of his earlier responses giving way to a faint edge. "Congresswoman," he said, choosing his words with more care now, "I must reiterate the importance of judicial independence. It is the cornerstone of our democracy. Without it, we risk undermining the very rule of law." A pause meant to be commanding, but now defensive. "While I understand your concerns, I fear we are beginning to politicize the judiciary, and that in itself poses a grave danger." The words echoed with the weight of legacy, but they no longer held the room. They floated in the air, brittle and hollow, like an old shield raised in a new kind of war. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't interrupt. She waited for him to finish, not out of politeness, but precision. Then she leaned in, just slightly, her voice steady as stone. "With all due respect, Chief Justice," she said, "independence without accountability is not strength. It's a golden cage, ornate, gleaming, but rotten from the inside out." The words hit like a controlled detonation, not shouted, not dramatized, just delivered with the full weight of lived experience and brutal clarity. Around the chamber, heads turned, not toward Roberts this time, but toward her. The quiet power in her voice had shifted the room's gravity. This wasn't just a line, it was a verdict. Roberts visibly stiffened, his jaw flexed, his hand slowly curling around the edge of the desk as if grounding himself. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but calculation, realizing that this wasn't a freshman congresswoman lobbing rhetorical grenades. This was a former public defender who had spent years watching courts crush the powerless under the illusion of neutrality. She had seen how justice dressed itself in robes while crushing people in uniforms. And now she was dragging that contradiction into the light, one sentence at a time. Roberts tried to speak again, but the rhythm was off. The courtroom veteran had lost the beat, and everyone watching could feel it. "I'm not here to politicize the judiciary," Jasmine continued, her tone sharpened just enough to slice without screaming. I'm here because people back home, people without lobbyists, without law degrees, without legacy surnames, have watched your court tip further and further away from fairness. And when they ask why, they don't get answers. They get doctrines. They get silence. She paused, eyes steady. So no, Chief Justice, this isn't about politics. This is about pain. The kind that builds when truth is replaced by tradition and power hides behind the word independence like it's armor. The line sliced through the room with surgical clarity. The Chief Justice's fingers tightened again on the desk. He looked composed but not calm. It was the look of a man who had walked onto a familiar battlefield only to find the terrain had changed. The court does not answer to public opinion, he said, his voice lower now but taut. We are not swayed by noise. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not in anger but recognition. It's not noise, she said, her tone unshaken. It's the sound of a country that's tired of justice being spoken in a language only the privileged understand. A murmur rose in the room. Not applause, not outrage, just truth, moving through people like voltage. At that moment, the power dynamic cracked. Roberts, for all his titles and tenure, found himself speaking to someone who didn't see him as an institution, but as a man capable of failure and no longer allowed to hide behind centuries of immunity. Jasmine wasn't yelling, she wasn't emoting, she was executing. One truth after another, each laid bare with a calm so deliberate it became its own form of force. You call this politicizing? She said. I call it surviving. I call it demanding that the law we're all told to believe in actually belongs to all of us. Every syllable struck like a gavel, not in the judge's hand, but in hers. For Roberts, the room had become unfamiliar terrain. His training, his tone, his tactics, they weren't working. He looked across at Jasmine, not like a superior defending his bench, but like a witness trying to locate the exit. And for the first time in his career, the courtroom, the one place he thought he could control with silence and structure, had turned on him. Not through rebellion, not through insult, but through clarity. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't finished, not even close. He looked across at Jasmine, not like a superior defending his bench, but like a witness trying to locate the exit. And for the first time, the courtroom, his courtroom, wasn't his anymore. That's when she made her move. Without raising her voice, Jasmine reached into the folder beside her, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a document bound by a single rust-red clip. No grand gesture, no theatrics. Just her hand, sliding across the lacquered surface of the desk, placing a packet of paper directly in front of the microphone like it was a loaded weapon with the safety off. I'd like to enter into the record, she said coolly, this financial report, obtained through publicly accessible filings and cross-referenced with campaign finance disclosures. The pages didn't look like much. No seals, no highlighter marks. But inside them was something more volatile than a scandal. It was a connection, a direct link between a sitting Supreme Court justice and a web of political investment funds that had quietly backed multiple parties appearing before the court in recent years. Jasmine tapped the corner of the packet. This hasn't been disclosed, not to this committee, not to the public, not even in amended statements. And just like that, the room cracked. A rustle rippled across the gallery. Staffers stiffened. Cameras zoomed in like predators spotting blood. Someone near the back coughed, sharp and involuntary, like air had gotten too thick to swallow. One senator leaned forward, trying to read the top line of the cover sheet. Another whispered to an aide, too low for the mic to catch. But the tension in the room wasn't just from the document. It was from what it represented. A breach. A break in the illusion that the nation's highest bench was above influence, untouched by the very forces that shaped everyone else's reality. What is this? A journalist muttered, half to herself, fingers already racing across a phone screen. From the second those papers hit the desk, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just asking questions anymore. She was holding evidence. Chief Justice Roberts didn't move at first. For a man trained in the art of composure, even stillness had become a tactic. But his knuckles whitened as his hand curled just slightly beneath the table. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence, once commanding, now rang hollow, like a bell struck too many times to mean anything. Jasmine continued, her voice cutting through the rising static of unease. Page 2 outlines a timeline of communication between a financial trust and a justice's family foundation. Page 4 includes transfer records coinciding with court filings. And page 6, she paused, not for drama, but for clarity. Page 6 shows a signature. That word, signature, hung in the air like a match over gasoline. One congressman whispered just loud enough to be caught on a hot mic, "This can't be real." Another leaned toward his colleague. "Is this verified?" No one answered. No one needed to. The expression on Jasmine's face said everything. She had checked every word, every decimal, every date. She hadn't brought a theory. She had brought receipts, and she wasn't done. "These aren't accusations," she said firmly. "These are connections. These are patterns. And if the court won't address them, then this chamber will." It wasn't just a political earthquake. It was a moral rupture. Because in a country where families had lost homes over missing paperwork, where lives had been upended over technicalities, the idea that a justice could sit on high and sign off on decisions tied to his own financial backers wasn't just offensive, it was betrayal. Jasmine didn't need to yell it. She made you feel it, like a quiet truth too long buried, finally clawing its way to the surface. She didn't point fingers. She opened files. And in doing so, she didn't just implicate one man. She indicted a culture. Roberts finally spoke, but his voice had shifted. No longer the even, controlled tone of a man above reproach. It cracked, just faintly at the edges. "These documents," he said, fingers resting flat against the table, "may represent partial information. Context is vital. There are internal reviews that—" But his words faded before they finished, because everyone knew what they were watching. It wasn't just an answer. It was an unraveling. One strand at a time, the threadbare fabric of judicial infallibility was coming undone. Under the lights, under the pressure, under Jasmine Crockett's unrelenting gaze. And she wasn't finished. Not even close. Roberts's voice cracked at the edges, clinging to procedure like it could shield him from the storm he no longer controlled. But Jasmine wasn't here for abstractions. She wasn't here for technicalities or half-truths wrapped in protocol. She was here to bring the human cost into the room, and now she did. She adjusted the microphone, her tone shifting, not softer, but heavier, like each word carried weight not just in policy, but in pain. "Let me tell you about someone I know," she said quietly, but the room fell still. "Her name is Carla Jennings. She lives in Houston. She's a single mother, works nights at a hospital, sterilizing surgical tools after 12-hour shifts on her feet. Never missed a tax filing, never broke a law, but one clerical error, one misfiled form, meant the IRS flagged her as delinquent. And because of that, when her son applied for federal student aid, it was denied." She paused. No one moved. She appealed. She filed. She waited. She called. She begged. And she was told, on the record, there was nothing to be done. Case closed. The words cut through the air, slow and precise, like piano keys struck in a dark room. "Her appeal never made it past the regional circuit," Jasmine continued, eyes fixed on the bench across from her. "No hearing, no review, no mercy, just a number in a database deemed invalid. A mother punished because a government form misread her worth." She let that sit, let it burn. And while she was waiting for a second chance, a billionaire with a private jet and personal access to a justice had his case expedited by the Supreme Court in less than 4 months. Murmurs stirred, soft but growing. Jasmine leaned forward. Same system, different rules. There was no outrage in her tone, just clarity sharpened to a blade. "We are told that justice is blind, that courts are neutral, that access to the law is equal." She looked slowly around the room. But Carla's son lost his dream over a typo, and a billionaire kept his empire. Because someone in that chair, she said, gesturing toward the table, opened a door the rest of us don't even get to knock on. A hush fell across the gallery. This wasn't just argument anymore. This was indictment, and everyone felt it. Cameras whirred, but no one blinked. Even the seasoned journalists didn't dare look away, because they knew moments like this didn't come with press releases. They came with truth. Raw, undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett, who had once stood in Texas courtrooms watching justice break people in silence, was now giving voice to every story too small to matter in rooms like this. "We cannot pretend that ethics live in theory," she said. "They live in consequences, and the people paying the highest price are the ones who don't have lawyers or donors or friends on the bench." The atmosphere in the room shifted. This wasn't just oversight. This was exposure. And as Jasmine spoke, the perception of her changed, not just to those in the chamber, but to millions who would later watch the moment unfold online. She wasn't just a congresswoman now. She was a witness for the voiceless, a challenger of the untouchable, a mirror to a court that could no longer claim innocence through distance. And across the table, Chief Justice Roberts sat still, because there was no rule, no statute, no robe thick enough to hide behind anymore. She wasn't just speaking for Carla Jennings anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt the weight of a system that preached fairness but practiced favoritism. And now, with the entire room caught in that slow, suffocating realization, Jasmine aimed straight for the heart. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted his posture, but it didn't help. The composure he had once worn like armor was cracking. His voice, which had carried decades of courtroom dominance, now trembled on the edge of hesitation. He reached for his glass of water, but his hand betrayed him, shaking just slightly as he brought it to his lips. And then Jasmine asked the question, director, unforgiving, sharp enough to strip any illusion of neutrality bare. "Do you still believe justice is equal?" she said, her voice slow and even. "Or has it become a product available only to those with access?" The room froze. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It wasn't meant for headlines. It was the kind of question that pierced not only institutions, but the people who had built their names on protecting them. Roberts looked up, but for the first time, there was no certainty in his eyes. He blinked once, twice. His mouth opened, and then closed again. When he finally spoke, it was a stammer. I I believe the, the structure of the court must," but the words collapsed before they formed. His voice caught, stumbled, and died under the weight of her question. For the first time in decades of hearings, speeches, and public appearances, John Roberts was speechless. It wasn't the kind of silence that invited sympathy. It was the kind that confirmed fear, the kind that made everyone in the room realize he had no answer, because deep down, maybe he didn't believe in the balance anymore. Maybe he knew the scales had tipped too far. That question, so simple on the surface, had shattered something sacred, the illusion that those who wore the robe were still unshaken in their principles. The man who once spoke of credibility as currency now found himself bankrupt in front of the nation. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She sat still, shoulders square, gaze unwavering, because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about reckoning. She had asked the question millions of Americans wanted to ask but never had the chance. And in his silence, Roberts had answered louder than words ever could. The weight of that unspoken truth fell like a curtain. One lawmaker near the back whispered, "He didn't answer." Another, stunned, leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "Because he can't." The camera zoomed in, capturing everything. The blink, the dry swallow, the tightening jaw. But no spin, no press release, no future memo would be able to erase what had just happened. The Chief Justice of the United States had been asked if justice was still blind, and he couldn't say yes. And Jasmine, she didn't move. She didn't need to, because in that moment, she wasn't just cross-examining a man. She was putting the entire system on trial. And the verdict, whether the court liked it or not, had just been rendered. He couldn't answer, and that silence did more damage than any admission ever could. The courtroom, once filled with the practiced cadence of formality and control, was now suspended in a moment so raw, so unplanned, that time itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. Still, no sound. No cough. No shuffle of paper. No chairman's voice to change the subject. The cameras stayed locked. The aides froze mid-note. And the man who once commanded this space with a flick of tone or a legal phrase now sat exposed, utterly alone. Not a single colleague came to his defense. Not a single senator offered him a lifeline. The air was electric, not with spectacle, but with consequence. Roberts lowered his gaze. Not in shame, perhaps, but in surrender. He had built his world on certainty, and Jasmine Crockett had just shattered the illusion that it still held. Then she spoke, not to finish him, but to lift something far more powerful than victory. Her voice, low and grounded, slid into the microphone like a whispered vow meant for the soul of the room. "I didn't come here to humiliate you," she said. "No edge, no triumph, just quiet gravity. I came here to tell the people of this country they have not been forgotten." The line didn't crack like thunder. It settled like ash after fire. Slow, haunting, final. Some in the room blinked. Others swallowed hard. Everyone felt it. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just challenge a justice. She had rewritten what it looked like to hold power accountable, without shouting, without slurs, without spectacle. Just with truth, with composure, with pain transmuted into precision. The words she spoke echoed not just in room 2141, but far beyond the marble columns of Capitol Hill. Within hours, the moment was clipped, uploaded, and ricocheted through every corner of the internet. They have not been forgotten. It appeared in captions and headlines, on protest signs and in morning news tickers. The phrase wasn't just powerful, it was proof. Proof that somewhere in the machine, someone had remembered the people crushed beneath it. Proof that courage could still exist, not in loud gestures, but in unshakable clarity. Jasmine's voice became a signal, and America, weary of silence, finally listened. The clip didn't just go viral, it detonated. By the time Jasmine Crockett left the hearing room and stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the world had already changed behind her. Across the marble halls of Capitol Hill, aides were staring down at their phones, eyes wide, jaws slack, watching a 47-second excerpt looping over and over. On it, her voice was unwavering, her gaze locked forward. "I didn't come here to humiliate you. I came here to tell the people of this country they have not been forgotten." No graphics, no music, just her words, and the silence that followed. Pure, devastating, unedited. On X, formerly Twitter, it exploded like dry brush under lightning. "They are not forgotten" surged to #1 worldwide in less than an hour. Hashtags multiplied like sparks from the blast. Crockett Truth, Golden Cage, Justice on Trial. Even users who had never tweeted about politics in their lives shared the moment. A nurse in Milwaukee, a warehouse worker in Tucson, a teacher in Mississippi who simply wrote, "That woman just spoke for me." They didn't need to know the full history of the Supreme Court. They didn't need to read ethics statutes. They felt it, the unspoken truth she had finally said aloud. In faculty lounges across Ivy League universities, professors stopped mid-discussion. At Yale Law, a tenured scholar who had clerked under two justices froze halfway through a lecture on constitutional originalism. He played the clip, hands trembling, not because of outrage, but because of recognition. "This," he whispered to the room of stunned students, "is what judicial legitimacy sounds like when it begins to crack." His colleague at NYU called it the beginning of the end of the myth. Over in Chicago, a first-year student who had once dreamed of wearing the robe herself watched the video 5 times before posting. "For the first time, I believe I could enter that courtroom and tell the truth without flinching." Former judges spoke on record. A retired federal appellate court justice appeared on PBS within hours. "She was deliberate, she was prepared, and she was right," he said. "If even half of what was in that folder holds up, then we're staring down an institutional crisis of integrity at the highest level of American law." The legal establishment wasn't just reeling, they were re-examining everything. Suddenly, lifetime appointments no longer looked like safeguards. They looked like cages built to protect privilege from accountability. But it wasn't just legal minds. It wasn't just the political class. It was the public, the people who tuned out long ago, convinced Washington was a circus where truth couldn't breathe. Jasmine's clip cut through that fog like a blade, because it wasn't a speech. It was a moment of unflinching honesty, and people weren't used to honesty surviving the halls of power. News outlets scrambled to catch up. CNN ran a special segment within the day. What justice really means. The Crockett confrontation. MSNBC aired the clip 12 times in a single hour. Even Fox News, caught off guard by the public's reaction, couldn't avoid covering it. One anchor, usually quick to mock congressional hearings, quietly said, "Whether you agree with her or not, that wasn't politics. That was something else." By the following morning, an official petition, launched by the nonpartisan Judicial Transparency Coalition, had gathered over 2.1 million signatures. The ask was clear: reopen the dormant ethics investigation into the financial disclosures of Supreme Court justices. But more than that, the petition demanded the creation of a binding, external judicial code of conduct. No more self-policing, no more internal reviews. The people for once wanted accountability, and they weren't whispering. Pressure built like a rising tide. Senate offices received tens of thousands of phone calls. Congressional inboxes were flooded. Editorial boards from the New York Times to the Des Moines Register published urgent pieces titled, "Crockett was right, in time to clean the bench." Public faith in the court, already eroding after years of controversial rulings and shadow dockets, dropped another 8 points in a single polling cycle, its lowest in modern American history. And still the clip moved. In lunchrooms, break rooms, union halls, community centers. It wasn't the complexity of the law that caught fire. It was the simplicity of the question. Do you still believe justice is equal, or is it just a product for the powerful? That question began to define the debate in state houses across the country. In Georgia, local lawmakers quoted Crockett on the floor. In Oregon, an ethics oversight bill was suddenly revived. In Texas, her home state, a radio host known for mocking DC theatrics played the full hearing segment and quietly said into the mic, "She's not yelling, she's not performing, she's just telling the truth, and I can't stop listening." Within 36 hours, the House Judiciary Subcommittee released an unexpected statement. Due to the volume of credible public concern and the emergence of new documented connections, we will reopen our investigation into undisclosed financial relationships among members of the judiciary. It didn't name names, it didn't cite Jasmine directly, but no one needed the citation. Everyone already knew who had kicked the door open. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just disrupted a hearing, she had sparked a movement. One built not on outrage, but on precision. Not on division, but on clarity. And that clarity was contagious. In a time of noise, she had made silence impossible. In a time of spin, she had spoken straight. And now the highest court in the land was no longer looking down from its marble steps. It was being called to answer. And the country, it was finally watching. The hearing had officially concluded, but the atmosphere in room 2141 refused to loosen its grip. The sound of chairs shifting, pens being capped, and murmurs rising was muffled, like background noise from another dimension. All eyes still rested on one man. Chief Justice John Roberts gathered his notes, stacking them with deliberate care, though his fingers trembled slightly at the edges. He didn't look up, not at first. The man who had walked into the room with a spine of steel and the weight of the Constitution behind him now looked like he was carrying something heavier than law, something harder to shake. Doubt. He stood slowly. His chair let out a dull scrape against the polished floor, and that sound, so ordinary, cut through the hush like a gunshot. His aides, pale and anxious, moved to his side, ready to shield him from the crush of questions they knew waited outside. The hallway was already filling with press. Microphones would swarm him like flies. But Roberts didn't step forward, not yet. He paused in the doorway, one hand resting on the wooden frame like a man deciding whether to leave a battlefield or return to it. Then he turned. His eyes found Jasmine across the chamber, not with fury, not with the chill of judicial detachment, but with something far rarer in these halls, a flicker of humility. A beat passed, another. And then he spoke, his voice low but deliberate, each syllable sounding less like a defense and more like confession. "You've done something today that I didn't think anyone could," he said. "You made me look at myself." The sentence hung in the air like incense. Quiet, fragrant, impossible to ignore. It wasn't applause-worthy. It wasn't scripted. It was real, and it landed heavier than any gavel ever could. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She held his gaze, not to challenge, but to absorb the weight of that moment, to mark it, to make sure the room remembered that even power, when faced with truth, must sometimes blink. And then softly, almost too softly for the cameras to hear, she turned to her aide and said only two words. "Let's begin." There was no triumph in her tone, no self-congratulation, just precision, purpose, resolve. Because this had never been about one exchange or one man. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the spark before the firestorm. She hadn't come to win applause. She came to pull the curtain back. And now that the curtain had fallen, the real work could begin. Across the room, a few aides exchanged stunned looks. A junior clerk from Maine muttered under her breath, "Did that just happen?" But no one answered, because everyone knew it had happened, and nothing would be the same again. Roberts turned back toward the hallway, his figure silhouetted against the light pouring in from outside. But he didn't carry the same authority he'd walked in with. He carried something else, a shadow of reckoning that would follow him long after this day. And Jasmine, she remained seated for another full minute, calm, steady, untouchable. Not because she had broken the court, but because she had reminded the country that it could be held accountable. As the door closed behind the Chief Justice, the hush finally gave way to motion. Reporters sprinted for cameras. Staffers made calls. Senators whispered about fallout. But at the center of it all, unmoved, sat the woman who had just shifted the national conversation with one line, one voice, and the kind of clarity that no institution could silence. And somewhere outside, the country was listening. Power doesn't scream when it breaks. It hums. It vibrates under the surface like a fault line waiting to give. And on that afternoon, after Jasmine Crockett uttered the words, "Let's begin," the foundation beneath America's most sacred institution didn't crumble, but it shifted. Not with thunder, with precision. Not in a single room, but across the country. Inside the Capitol, the usual post-hearing choreography unraveled. Staffers didn't immediately leap into spin control. Reporters didn't rush the exits with hot takes. Something, unnamed but undeniable, had rooted them in place. A few whispered, some stared. One aide, clutching a tablet, simply said, "I think we just witnessed something historic." A moment like that doesn't come from volume or anger. It comes from truth, wielded with the cold stillness of someone who's walked through fire and no longer fears heat. Outside room 2141, the corridors of Congress were unusually still. Men in tailored suits, senators who'd coasted on reputation for decades, glanced toward the room like they were afraid of what might still be echoing from within. Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't grandstanded. She had simply dismantled one of the most insulated men in American law, with facts, questions, and the unrelenting steadiness of someone who no longer accepted the lie that power equals virtue. In a coffee shop 3 blocks away, a Junior Hill staffer replayed the clip on his cracked iPhone, earbuds trembling from the sharp stillness of her tone. Around him, people leaned in, not because of the usual spectacle, but because they saw something unfamiliar in Washington: consequence. The effect rippled outward, quiet but furious. At the Department of Justice's Office of Government Ethics, Michelle Torrey, an ethics compliance officer known for keeping her head down, sat alone in her cubicle at 6:47 p.m., rewatching the entire exchange for the third time. She had worked on a dormant internal inquiry 2 years prior regarding luxury gifts, undisclosed ties, and what she had once called the untouchable class. She had submitted a memo. It went nowhere, died in a locked drawer under the weight of politics. But now, after that hearing, it stirred again. She dug through her archive files and found it. Memo 019, potential violations, judicial disclosures. Scribbled in the margin were her own words from 2 years ago. "We can't prove it, but we know." This time she didn't file it away. She printed it, and sent it up the chain. Meanwhile, at Georgetown Law, Professor David Halpern, a man who had clerked under Justice O'Connor and once believed the system would police itself, paused mid-lecture. His students were staring at their screens instead of their notes. "All right," he said, closing his laptop. "We're not doing theory today." He turned to the board and scrawled a single phrase, "Appearance of impropriety," then under it, Crockett versus Roberts. Let's talk about what that really means. On cable news, anchors fumbled for framing. One tried calling it an unexpected confrontation, while another dared call it reckless. But the audience wasn't buying it. Comment sections filled not with partisanship, but clarity. She said it without raising her voice. "I've waited 20 years to hear someone speak like that." We finally saw power have to explain itself. But it wasn't just elites reacting. In a steelworkers union hall in Youngstown, Ohio, a man named Frank, 58, former Marine, long disillusioned, stood before a group of younger workers and played the clip over the sound system. The room went dead silent. When it ended, no one cheered. No one clapped. Frank just said, "That's what accountability's supposed to sound like." He hadn't voted in 12 years. That night, he registered again. Across state capitals, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, legislators began whispering about judicial reform again. Not publicly, not yet, but the ground had moved beneath their feet. Lobbyists who once laughed off talk of Supreme Court accountability now stayed quiet in meetings. A memo from a conservative think tank leaked the next morning. The subject line read, "Urgent, contain the Crockett effect." And in private chambers, behind walls designed to keep the public out, a handful of federal judges, lifetime appointees, watched the clip in silence. Some seethed, others listened, but all of them knew what it meant. The curtain had been pulled back, not with rage, but with surgical poise. Jasmine hadn't insulted the court. She had reminded it of what it was supposed to be before the private jets, the sealed records, and the silent nods from billionaires. Because truth isn't loud, it's undeniable. And something inside the American system had just shifted. Not in a headline, not in a speech, in the collective gut feeling of millions of people who knew something was wrong, but had never heard it spoken from within the walls of power. Until now, the first calls didn't come from journalists or politicians. They came from people. Not the kind who sit in Senate chambers or wear badges into courtrooms, but the ones who fill pews on Sundays, who fought wars overseas, who worked steel in Pittsburgh or ran farms outside Topeka. They called not to complain, not to scream, but to say something few in power had heard in years. Thank you. In Jasmine Crockett's district office, the voicemail inbox filled in hours. One caller, his voice cracked with age, left just 4 words. "You spoke for me." Another, from a retired police officer in Baton Rouge, said, "I've testified under oath more times than I can count, but I've never seen someone hold a man like that to his." These weren't policy debates. They weren't about party lines. They were about something older, deeper, the longing for someone to finally tell the truth without flinching. Emails flooded in, thousands, then tens of thousands. A Vietnam vet in Montana wrote, "I stopped trusting government after 72. I never thought I'd feel something like this again. But what you said, that was real. That was earned." A single mother in Kansas sent a letter. "I went to court 3 years ago and was told my son's case wasn't serious enough. Your story about Carla? That was me. Thank you for making them hear it." By morning, her office's lines were jammed. Local staff scrambled to bring in volunteers just to process the messages. Reporters called it a viral moment. But it wasn't viral like a meme. It was cellular. It got into people's bones. Because Jasmine hadn't performed. She had testified, not on behalf of a bill or a party, but on behalf of the forgotten. The second wave of calls was louder and came from the top. A senior advisor to the Speaker of the House rang her office directly. "What's your availability next week?" he asked, voice tight, controlled. "The leadership wants to meet. They want to understand what happened in there." Across the aisle, a moderate Republican from Wisconsin sent a private text. "Don't agree with you on much, but what you did, that was something this place needed." Even the president's chief counsel reportedly circled her name in a morning briefing. The White House didn't release a statement. Not yet, but the silence said enough. They were watching, and they weren't alone. At the Judicial Conference of the United States, where the judiciary reviews its internal procedures, a closed-door meeting was hastily scheduled. Topic: public trust erosion post-Crockett hearing. For years, they had swatted away reform proposals with vague promises of self-regulation. But now the conversation had a name, and it was no longer abstract. One committee member reportedly asked, "What if the public doesn't wait for us to act?" No one in the room had an answer. Think tanks scrambled too. The Brookings Institution issued a midnight memo titled, "The Integrity Question: What Crockett Exposed," while the Heritage Foundation called for an urgent internal review. Normally, these institutions argued across oceans, but now both were staring at the same iceberg. Meanwhile, something quieter happened. In a modest two-story home in Texas, an elderly black woman sat at her kitchen table, watching the clip for the fifth time. Her husband, a retired machinist, leaned over her shoulder. She turned and whispered, "That girl up there, that's what I prayed for in '68. He didn't answer, just nodded. Sometimes vindication doesn't come with cheers. It comes with stillness. The impact wasn't just political, it was generational. In high schools across America, civics teachers scrapped their lesson plans. They played the hearing. Students watched in silence. Some shifted in their chairs. Others asked questions they never had before. One 17-year-old in Houston raised her hand and said, "So, if the law can be questioned, then we're not powerless?" And for the first time in that classroom, the teacher didn't have to give the answer. Jasmine Crockett already had. On social media, the conversation evolved. Nashar Crockett effect began trending alongside Let Them Answer and Golden Cage. But the hashtags weren't enough. Activists mobilized, lawyers convened. A group of former public defenders drafted a petition demanding the Supreme Court adopt a formal, enforceable code of ethics, like every other court in the country. Within 48 hours, over 3.2 million signatures, a number not even the court could ignore. And in an unexpected twist, some sitting judges began to speak, privately, anonymously, but with clear intent. One federal judge in the Ninth Circuit gave an off-the-record quote to a legal journalist. "I've sat on this bench for 22 years. I've never seen someone walk into a hearing and make a justice look like a man again." Jasmine had touched something raw, untended for too long, because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the great American question: is justice something that lives in marble halls, or in the people willing to hold those halls accountable? And now, that question was being asked, out loud, everywhere. And the answers were no longer coming from robes and titles. They were coming from us. The cameras were gone. The marble halls were silent. Outside the Capitol, the city had shifted back into its usual rhythm: cars honking, aides rushing across streets, late dinners in crowded bars. But miles away, in a quiet apartment tucked behind a church in the southeast D.C., Jasmine Crockett sat awake, staring at the ceiling, and knew one thing for certain. She had started something she couldn't walk away from. Her heels sat abandoned near the doorway. The blazer that had faced down a Supreme Court justice hung limply over the back of a chair. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional buzz of her phone. Texts, missed calls, news alerts. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. Her face was everywhere. Her voice, her questions, her silence after Robert stumbled, all of it had become national oxygen. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She hadn't even changed clothes. On the coffee table sat a photo of her mother, hands calloused from factory work, eyes soft but unyielding. And beside that, a worn file folder, the same one she had carried into room 2141. Inside it were names, not headlines. Carla Jennings, Jorge Salgado, Nia Reynolds, David Huang. Real people, real cases, real pain. None of them would trend on Twitter, but all of them were the reason she couldn't sleep. Because while the country buzzed with applause, Jasmine Crockett sat there with the ache of truth. Not the kind that wins arguments, but the kind that costs something, and she felt every inch of it pressing on her chest like the weight of a courtroom door closing. Her phone lit up again. A senator had texted, "You're changing the game. Let me know if you're thinking higher office." She didn't respond, because that wasn't what this was about. It never had been. In her mind, she replayed Robert's face. Not the part where he fumbled, but the part just after. The moment when the mask slipped. When he saw her not as a freshman congresswoman, not as a headline, but as a reckoning. That flicker of recognition haunted her, not because it pleased her, but because it proved something she'd always feared. Even the most powerful men don't reflect until they're forced to. And still, she couldn't sleep. She walked barefoot to the window. The city lights shimmered like fireflies. Somewhere out there, in homes filled with silence and survival, people were watching clips of her testimony, not because she was famous, but because they finally saw themselves in power for once. A black woman, a former public defender, someone who wasn't supposed to speak like that, wear that ring, raise those questions, and yet there she was, steady, surgical, unafraid. She took a breath, deep, held it, released. She thought of the men who had ruled for decades without question, of every time she'd been told to wait her turn, to tone it down, to earn her place, and she thought about what she had said to her aide earlier that day when Roberts turned back and whispered, "You made me look at myself." 2 words. Let's begin. Because Jasmine knew the fight wasn't over. It had barely started. The court hadn't changed overnight. Roberts hadn't resigned. No ethics code had passed yet. But something had cracked. And once marble cracks, it never fully seals again. That's how water gets in. That's how change begins. The clock read 3:14 a.m. She rubbed her eyes, sat on the floor, opened the file again, not to relive the hearing, but to read the last letter inside. It was from a prisoner in Huntsville, Texas. Handwritten, shaky script. It ended with one sentence. "If someone like you can ask them why, maybe one day they'll have to answer to the rest of us too." She closed the folder. Still not tired, but no longer restless. She wasn't waiting for justice to wake up. She was going to drag it out of bed herself. She didn't rest, not because she couldn't, but because too many others never got the chance. And as the world began to react to what she'd done, the story beneath the headlines finally revealed itself. Not about one woman's voice, but about a nation's silence finally being broken. It would have been easy to walk away, to let the moment pass and return to business as usual. That's what power counts on, that we forget, that we move on, that the echo fades, that truth, no matter how loud, eventually drowns in comfort and distraction. But this time it didn't, because Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she held the room, and by doing so, she held up a mirror to all of us. What we saw wasn't flattering. We saw a justice system more concerned with preserving prestige than pursuing truth. We saw a Chief Justice struggling to justify double standards with rehearsed language that suddenly rang hollow. And more painfully, we saw a woman, composed, razor-sharp, carrying names and stories and facts like weapons, being dismissed until she forced them to listen. And when she did, the nation remembered something it had almost forgotten. Power without accountability is not leadership, it's abandonment. This wasn't the story of a political ambush. It wasn't theatrics. It wasn't rage. It was surgical courage. Crockett didn't attack the institution. She demanded it live up to the very ideals it claimed to protect. That was the message. We will no longer bow to the robe if the robe refuses to bow to truth. In that moment, Jasmine was not simply a congresswoman. She became the embodiment of every American who has ever sat in the back of a courtroom, clutching evidence that no one wanted to see. Every mother who begged for fairness while watching her child get sentenced for a crime others walk away from. Every veteran who defended the Constitution only to return home and be denied the justice he fought to protect. Every blue-collar father who knew the system worked, but never for him. For them, she wasn't just speaking truth to power, she was speaking on their behalf, and the power finally had to listen. The hearing may have ended in silence, but across America, a different kind of noise began to rise. Not protest, not chaos, awakening. In city halls, ordinary people began asking their council members hard questions. If the Supreme Court isn't held to a code of ethics, why should we believe in yours? In courtrooms from Tulsa to Detroit, young public defenders played Jasmine's clip during training seminars. One instructor stood at the front of a law school classroom in Chicago and said, "Forget moot court. This is what real advocacy looks like." Even behind locked doors in state bar associations, the conversation changed. One judge, anonymous in transcript, admitted, "I saw her stare him down, and I asked myself, when was the last time I let someone question me like that?" Because that was the true weight of what happened that day. She didn't beat Roberts. She reminded him he could bleed, not physically, but institutionally, legally, morally. She cracked the myth of invincibility around his chair, not with a hammer, but with a whisper. You don't get to hold justice and hide from judgment. And the silence that followed, that wasn't defeat. That was exposure. But this isn't just about courts or judges. The message she left behind reached further than marble pillars and law reviews. It reached into living rooms, truck stops, school cafeterias, and factory floors. Into the places where men who have served, sacrificed, and struggled sat with their arms crossed, waiting to roll their eyes. But they didn't, because Jasmine didn't speak at them. She spoke for them. For the man in Arkansas whose Social Security case got buried in red tape. For the coal worker in West Virginia whose lung disease claim was dismissed after 20 years of service. For the nurse in rural Alabama who was told she didn't qualify for legal assistance. For the janitor in Phoenix whose wrongful eviction was filed under the wrong case code and never corrected. She wasn't reciting statistics. She was naming the weight these people carry every day. And when she looked a Supreme Court justice in the eye and asked if he even remembered what the people saw when they looked at his court, they all knew the answer. Power that forgets who it serves is no longer justice. It's shadow. But Jasmine Crockett's legacy isn't just what she said. It's what she started. After her testimony, an unprecedented bipartisan resolution was introduced, demanding that the U.S. Supreme Court be held to the same enforceable ethics standards as lower courts. Legal scholars called it performative. Lobbyists called it impossible. But the people? They called it finally. By the following week, town halls were packed. Activists didn't chant. They handed out copies of judicial financial disclosures and taught senior citizens how to file FOIA requests. This wasn't outrage. This was infrastructure, a different kind of power, a patient kind, a relentless kind, the kind Jasmine had carried in her folder all along. And then something remarkable happened. Carla Jennings, the single mother from Texas, whose story Jasmine had told, received a letter in the mail. It was from a federal appeals clerk. It said her case was being reviewed again. No guarantees, no promises, just a second look. That's all she ever wanted, a chance. So what's the lesson? It's not that courage wins. Sometimes it doesn't. It's not that truth changes everything overnight. Sometimes it doesn't. The lesson is this. The people closest to the pain must be closest to the power. Because no system, not a court, not a government, not a nation, can survive when it forgets the people it was built to protect. And sometimes it takes just one voice, spoken clearly, fearlessly, and with relentless clarity, to remind an empire of its promises. Jasmine Crockett didn't burn the court down. She simply turned on the light and made sure the rest of us could see exactly what had been hiding in the dark. But stories like Jasmine's aren't meant to be admired from a distance. They're meant to ignite something. Because if one woman can face down the highest court in the land and make it blink, then none of us have an excuse to stay silent anymore. Now is not the time to sit back. Not when injustice wears a robe. Not when silence is marketed as dignity. Not when systems built to serve are weaponized to survive. Jasmine Crockett didn't risk her reputation just to create a moment. She built a mirror and dared every one of us to look in. The question now is, what are we going to do with what we saw? Don't wait for the next hearing. Don't wait for the next hashtag. Don't wait for the next Carla or Jorge to be denied a fair shot. Demand real oversight, share this story, write your representatives, sign the petitions, join the legal coalitions calling for a formal Supreme Court code of ethics. Show up in your city council, your school board, your local courtrooms, and remind them, we're watching now. Because justice isn't self-sustaining. It needs fuel, it needs questions, it needs inconvenient truth, and it needs people, ordinary people, willing to speak up when the room goes quiet. That's how Jasmine did it. That's how we must do it too. Power only shifts when pressure meets purpose. So if this story lit something in you, don't let it burn out. Let it burn forward. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.